Are you happy for your child to have a named person under the new changes published yesterday? Well, the Scottish Government has published alterations to its controversial named person scheme after the Supreme Court ruled last year that specific proposals about information sharing were incompatible with the rights to privacy and a family life under the European Convention of Human Rights. Let's get details of these changes now from Mark McDonald, who is Minister for Childcare and Early Years. Mr McDonald, good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you very much indeed for coming on to BBC Radio Scotland. Tell us about the changes. What specifically have you introduced?
So what we've introduced in the new legislation is a duty to consider in relation to the sharing of information. Now, what that means is that those professionals who are engaging with the named person will have to actively consider whether there is a need to share information in relation to the well-being of the child, and that the information will then be shared. So that lifts the threshold in terms of the sharing of information in line with where the Supreme Court was directing us, and we believe that this will ensure that parents and families who may have felt that the information sharing requirements previously were unclear or perhaps gave them some concerns can have some certainty that the clear focus, as it always was intended to be, is around the well-being of the child.
Specifically about the sharing of this information then, you say that you want parents to have the confidence. Who will actually take the decision about whether information can be shared or not?
Well, that information, that decision will rest with the professionals in question, and what we're doing here is ensuring that the sharing of information will be compatible with data protection law, human rights law, and the law of confidentiality.
Does that not run the risk of being hugely subjective?
No, well, only we have a situation just now in Scotland where professionals do share information on a regular basis. What we're doing here is ensuring that in relation to the named person function, we set down the very specific criteria that the Supreme Court were seeking in relation to ensuring that in relation to data protection, human rights and the law of confidentiality, the information shared in relation to the well-being of the child is compatible with those legal areas.
Parents may wonder this morning why, after all this, Supreme Court rulings, etc., there appears to be no option for parents to opt out of this highly controversial scheme.
Well, I think, I'd be cautious of editorialising it as a highly controversial scheme.
Well, it hasn't been a smooth passage for you since this was first raised by you.
But if you look at the ruling in relation to the policy intention that sits behind the named person, the Supreme Court was very clear that the policy direction in relation to the named person was, and I quote, unquestionably legitimate and benign. The question was around whether or not the threshold for the sharing of information in relation to well-being had been set appropriately. And that's what we've had to go back and reconsider in relation to this legislation. Now, in terms of the point that you make in relation to opt-out, there was never been a question that parents were compelled to engage with the named person service, and that remains the case. And non-engagement with the named person service was never seen as being indicative of a risk to the child, and that remains the case as well. So
parents may not see that, though. If they don't actively engage, will there not immediately be a finger of suspicion?
No, there absolutely will not, and that was never the case previously. That remains the case now. It's unfortunate that some chose to try and create a sense of suspicion in relation to that, and that's disappointing. But I want to make it very clear to your listeners today that is not the case. In relation to your point about opt-out, though, I think it's worth remembering as well that what we're not doing here is creating new posts which will be filled by people who will solely be identified as a named person. What we're doing here is ensuring that the named person function will be held by health visitors, head teachers, or guidance teachers. So these are people with whom families will have interactions on a range of different issues. The named person function merely identifies them as the lead professional, if you like, to whom other professionals should be sharing information under the rules that we are putting in place in relation to the child's well-being.
Official critics of the scheme say that you now have to retrain those who have already been trained to implement an unlawful scheme. Opposition parties are saying this is a major U-turn. They're accusing you of wasting time and money. How do you respond?
Well, I've looked at what the Conservatives have said in relation to what they call a major U-turn. And I have to say that all that seems to suggest is that the Conservatives didn't actually understand the scheme in the first place and what it was intended to do, but that rather was obvious from what they had been saying during that period. In relation to the notion of retraining, we are confident that what we are putting in place in terms of the duties around information sharing and the guides that will follow from that will be very easy to understand.
Will that involve retraining? You say it's easy to understand. Will that involve retraining?
Well, there will undoubtedly be a need throughout the named person service for training to be provided.
OK, so that you will have to retrain people. Can I just be clear about that?
So what we are putting in place now is a codification around information sharing, which will give greater clarity to professionals in terms of the thresholds and the processes they need to go through in order to share information. So that is what we're currently doing. That will be set out within guidance. In terms of the function of the named person and the intention that sits behind the named person, that remains unchanged in terms of their role in order to ensure that the well-being of the child is given due consideration.
What about criticism by the Liberal Democrats? We've mentioned the Conservatives. However, the Lib Dems are saying that there's a very real risk that the limited changes now being proposed will not be enough to regain the confidence of families across Scotland. You say this is not a controversial scheme, but nevertheless, this is a scheme that you had hoped to roll out by now. It's still not here. It has been dragged through courts. It has been appealed. It has been debated. It has gone to the Supreme Court. Do you think that the Scottish Government has now done enough to regain the confidence of Scottish families?
Well, I recognise that simply passing legislation in and of itself doesn't turn around some of those perceptions, and we will continue to engage with parents, with families, with those who have concerns to assuage them of those concerns. It's something I do on a regular basis in the conversations that I have with constituents, or even as a parent myself in engaging with other parents at the school playground. So I believe that those who support this scheme have an obligation, and I believe Alec Cole-Hamilton, Lib Dem MSP, was one of the fiercest advocates of this policy when he was working in the third sector. So I'd be very disappointed if he'd suddenly changed his tune now. But people like myself, people like the Liberal Democrats, who I think profess to support the approach in relation to named person, have a duty to ensure that we make sure that people understand what this does and the support that it can offer to families, so that families can have confidence in relation to that.
For families listening this morning who are not completely convinced by what you're saying, they have not got the confidence in the scheme, just be absolutely clear, what options do they have? So
if they do not wish to take up the support or advice offered by the named person, there is no compulsion on them to do so. I would hope that people would wish to take up support and advice offered by the named person. It exists as an entitlement for people to receive the support that they can sometimes need without any expectation that they would require it, and often can help in identifying and signposting people to appropriate services to support them and their family. But if parents are of the mind that they do not wish to engage with or to take the advice that is offered by the named person. There is no compulsion on them to do that. There never was previously, and that remains the case.
How would they go about informing the authorities that they do not wish to engage? Is it a formal process?
No, it's simply, what we're talking about here is non-engagement. So it's not a case of going to the authorities and saying, I do not wish to have any dealings with a named person. And the reason why that's important, Louise, is that here and now, people might be thinking to themselves, I will never have a requirement to use the named person service. And that's a decision that they are open to take. Mm-hmm. But 3 years down the line, something may happen in their lives that requires them to rely upon that support.
Okay.
So that support will always be there and always be available for those families, for those children, should they require it. So it is very much for them to then ensure that to then take up that advice and support should they choose to do so. But there is no compulsion on them to do that.
So I think that's an important point, just to reiterate that opting in or opting out or disregarding the advice or not wanting to engage with the advice, I should perhaps say, could be done on a case-by-case basis.
Indeed, yes, and I think that is the sensible way, I think, to proceed on this, so that families know that in the event that they might need that support, because none of us know what waits around the corner. If that support and advice is required at some point in the future, it remains available. OK.
Mark McDonald, many thanks indeed for your time this morning. That was Minister for Childcare and Early Years, Mark McDonald, outlining changes to the named person scheme, which the Scottish Government published yesterday. So let me just sum up those changes for you, because we want to know whether you are still happy for your child to be part of the named person scheme. These changes include ensuring that public bodies can only share information about children if it is likely to promote, support or safeguard the well-being of the child. And public bodies sharing this information will also be required to consider whether sharing would be compatible with data protection and confidentiality. So that's the kind of crux of the changes that have been brought in, introduced by the government yesterday. Do they go far enough for you? Do you still have confidence in the named person scheme? And indeed, are you happy for your child still to be part of this scheme? Get in touch with us this morning, 08085 92 95 00. 08085 92 95 00. We'll be talking to John in Edinburgh right after this.
Edie meets the award-winning documentary filmmaker who's always looking to break new ground.
I want to make films that strike a chord with a lot of people.
Sue Bourne talks candidly about documenting her mother's Alzheimer's disease.
It's a wonderful memory, I think, for the three of us, about the fun that we had at the end.
How she coped with her own life-changing diagnosis.
For me, cancer was a turning point. In many ways, actually, I'm kind of almost grateful that I had it.
And what drives her?
It's tenacity. I am dogged to a fault.
Stark Talk with Sue Bourne.
As long as I keep coming up with films that do well and get people talking, they'll keep commissioning me.
Today at 1:30 on BBC Radio Scotland. Get in touch with BBC Radio Scotland. Dial our free phone number 08085 92 95 00. You can text 80295. Network charges apply. This is BBC Radio Scotland.
And I'm Louise White here on BBC Radio Scotland, sitting in for Kay this morning. Good to have your company. On the phone in, we are talking about named person. Are you still happy for your child to have a named person under the changes published yesterday? I highlighted these changes. Obviously, the Minister for Childcare and Early Years, Mark McDonald, explained them a lot more robustly during the first 10 or 15 minutes or so of the programme. But just to sum it up, these changes, which have come into place after the Supreme Court ruling last August, said that public bodies can only share information about children if it's likely to promote, support and safeguard the well-being of the child, and that the public bodies sharing this information will also be required to consider whether it's compatible with data protection and confidentiality. So what we're asking you this morning is, are you happy for your child to continue in this scheme? Do you have confidence in the scheme? We'd like to hear from you this morning, 08085 92 95 00. Let's go to Edinburgh and speak to John. John, good morning to you. We don't have John. OK, let's We do have John. John, good morning.
Hi, good morning. How are you?
We're very well. We thought you disappeared. Glad to have you back.
Okay.
I hope you heard what Mark McDonald, the Minister for Childcare and Early Years, had to say. What is your reaction? Are you still happy for your child to be part of this scheme?
For myself specifically, I'm not. But then we're in a very unusual situation. My child is the only child in the UK suffering from a very rare disease called familial cold autoinflammatory syndrome type 2. We've been writing to ministers going back to 2014, back to Aileen Campbell, stating that children with rare diseases should be taken out of this system because medical evidence, social policy evidence, and legal evidence has proven that parents of children with rare diseases know more about their diseases most of the time than the doctors that are actually dealing with the disease. Mm-hmm. For example, in the case of my son, I'm in contact with 13 out of 27 patients worldwide, or the parents, who are suffering from the disease, and I am looked at as the expert in the disease. Now, how can a named person say how I'm dealing with my son's disease? It's just not true. The government are not listening. After the High Court ruling, the Supreme Court ruling came down, Mr. Swinney said that he was listening. I have written letters to him. I have written reminders asking him to contact me because the 300,000 rare disease community in Scotland have not been listened to at all.
OK. In terms of what Mark McDonald had to say, there is not the option for parents to opt out of the scheme, but nevertheless, parents do have the option to opt out of the advice on a case-by-case issue. Does that not go some way to help you in your situation?
It goes some way, but it doesn't go. We still don't know what this named person is doing behind the scenes.
Well, we do know that now they have to consider the sharing of information. They can only share this information if they feel that it is compatible with the promotion, support and safeguarding of the child.
That's right. But why are they gathering this information on every child in Scotland anyway? How much money is it costing? Our health service, we only heard a few weeks ago about the Edinburgh Royal Infirmary was in extremis. You're gathering all this information on every child in Scotland, whereas now they're not allowed to share the information, but they're still gathering in the information. And what's done with that information, we honestly don't know. Excuse me. We honestly don't know. Mm-hmm. It's still, I mean, he keeps saying he's listening, and he's listening and listening. I've written at least 20 letters to different ministers since 2014, and I haven't even had one acknowledgement. Okay. In fact, to find out who to write to after Mr. Swinney announced to Parliament that he would be listening to us, I had to go to the Children's Commissioner because I knew him and said, look, who do I write to here? They're saying that they're listening, but they're not saying this is who you write to. OK. John, I appreciate that you find yourself in a unique position, and I'm sorry that you find yourself in this position, but I wonder if you can just stay with us because I'd like to bring in Gabby, who's our next caller, and listen just to the general comments that she is making, and then perhaps you can respond. So Gabby, who's on the line from Stirlingshire, good morning.
Morning.
What do you think about the changes? Do they go far enough for you? And indeed, do you have confidence in the named person scheme?
I do have. I have a majority. I suppose 95%. As I say, I work in childcare. I've worked in childcare and the early years for 25 years. I have 5 children of my own, and I appreciate what this chap, I'm sorry, I can't remember his name. I appreciate John. What you're saying, John. I appreciate, John, what you're saying, and I understand where you're coming from. But I do think that you need to remember that Scotland's youngest people are Scotland's future, and Scotland's youngest people need protective measures there in place for them. I have experience of lots of lovely families with lovely children, but I have worked in places of deprivation where children are neglected, and the neglect has gone unnoticed. So I think in order to protect Scotland's youngest people, I think it's a great idea. And, it's not such a big, huge expense. It's giving an old-fashioned thing a new name, the named person, the health visitor or the head teacher of the primary school. It's gathering information on our youngest people, but with promises of not to share it. And we're all working hard for Scotland's youngest people, our little children, our babies, our teenagers. Scotland's working to become the best place in the world, and so, that will take time. And unfortunately, John's experiences are not the same as mine.
OK. Well, let's get John's reaction. I mean, Gabby clearly stating she appreciates that she comes at it from a different approach from you. You're clearly concerned with the unique situation that you find yourself in, John. But speaking more generally, can you accept where Gabby is coming from, in as much that we have to do everything we can to help safeguard the future of Scotland's next generation?
I do agree with her. I agree. We really do have to do it. However, doing it for every child in Scotland, when I just a figure off the top of my head, maybe 95% of these children won't actually need the named person, seems to be a waste of resources. And saying it doesn't cost very much money is not true either. I mean, just to reteach the people what we've taught them before, and the announcement yesterday is going to cost at least £1 million, and I'm quite sure that it'll go above the £1 million. Most of the unions have been against this. There's 1,111 children's charities in Scotland, and only 11 children's charities in Scotland came out for this.
OK, lots of you texting in. John, I do appreciate your time this morning. Gabby, my thanks to you as well. Lots of you texting in on 80295. Ian in the Black Isle. I would have no issues with a named person for children at risk, but there is no requirement for it to be applied to all children. It's a typical Scottish Government intrusion into our lives. Pete Gittins, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Peter, from Stirling. He says, we live in the most PC time ever. Social workers are too frightened to report suspicious behaviour. School teachers miss seeing it, or they're being put off reporting it. These professionals are already missing children at risk. So how will the named person improve the situation? It will make the bad people more devious and the good parents feel as though Big Brother is watching them. The views of Peter. 80295 is our text number. 08085 92 95 00 is our phone number. Lots of you texting in, lots of you getting in touch. We're getting through as many calls as we can. I think before we speak to Simon Calvert, who has been one of the main campaigners against this scheme. We'll be speaking to Simon in just a moment. Let's catch up with the latest travel news, if they are standing by. Good morning, Zoe.
Good morning, Louise. Thank you. I'll start in Glasgow on the M77, slow-moving traffic northbound at Junction 2 for Barhead Road. Now, elsewhere, there's congestion on the M8 between junctions 17 and 16. This is westbound, so junction 16, Craig Hall. And elsewhere, it's slow moving at junction 9 for the Clydeside Expressway, and it's also slow moving on the Clydeside Expressway itself, eastbound at Finnisan Street. In Edinburgh, slow on the A8. There was an accident here earlier on which involved two vehicles, so traffic still moving slowly westbound. It's just before Newbridge. And elsewhere, temporary traffic lights in Edinburgh on the A902 Telford Road, so that is causing congestion in both directions at Groat Hill Road North. On the ferries, a special timetable on Calmax North Ayrshire service between Ardrossan and Brodick, and also changes to Argyll's Gourock to Dunoon service, so departing Gourock at 20 minutes past the hour and Dunoon at 10 to the hour. That's BBC Radio Scotland Travel.
Many thanks indeed, Zoe. Back to the phone in just a moment. Let me also tell you what's coming up a little later on in the programme. Just after 10, we're going to be talking to Anne Meikle. Now, she is a lady who is no longer housebound after she won back her mobility car. So we'll be hearing her story and how she managed to get that decision reversed. That's just one of the topics that we're going to be discussing between 10 and 12 here on the morning programme. 80295 is our text number. If you want to pick up the phone and join in the conversation, we are talking about the named person scheme. You can get in touch, share your views with us this morning on 08085 92 95 00. Lots of you texting in, and I promise I'm not ignoring you. I will get through as many of your texts as possible. But I want to bring in Simon Calvert now. He is from the Christian Institute and he's also spokesperson for the No to Named Person campaign. Simon, good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you very much indeed for joining us this morning. You will have heard what Mark McDonald, Minister for Childcare and Early Years, had to say. He outlined the changes that the Scottish Government have introduced. These were published yesterday, so still quite a lot for people to take on board. Your first reaction to what the Minister said?
Well, there's two big themes that we have to address. One is the information sharing and one is the opt-out. And I have to say, I was astonished that after all these years and after a very embarrassing defeat for the Scottish Government in the UK Supreme Court, that the Minister still doesn't seem to understand what was wrong with the original law, and he doesn't even seem to properly understand the new bill that his government has just introduced.
Can I just say that you say it was an embarrassing climb down. Nevertheless, the Supreme Court has ruled definitively that promoting and safeguarding the well-being of a child was unquestionably legitimate and benign.
Of course, but it didn't say that the means used to promote the well-being of the child in the named person legislation was benign. You know, I mean, we all agree, and we never ever challenged the idea of promoting the well-being of a child. We never said that wasn't a good thing. What we said was the mechanisms that the government was introducing in its legislation were bad mechanisms, and the Supreme Court agreed with us on the information sharing. So the minister's the minister has left you with the impression that that named persons will only share information if it's relevant to well-being. That's dead wrong. That's the threshold for data sharing that the Supreme Court struck down and denounced as a breach of human rights. So, I mean, I've got the new bill in front of me. What it says is that the named persons have to identify information that they hold that could promote well-being, and then they have to consider whether any of that information could be provided in compliance with the Data Protection Act. And what we always argued was that the threshold for information sharing, for sharing private information on children and their families, should remain at the level of the Data Protection Act, because that protects people's privacy from unwarranted sharing of their information, whilst at the same time allowing the authorities to share information where it was necessary to protect a child. And that's the system that we have had for years. That's the system that we are now reverting to. And that's the climb down. So I'm amazed that the minister didn't seem to understand that. The second point is the opt-out. That has never been clear at all. The legislation certainly never included a clear opt-out. It still doesn't include a clear opt-out, and we think it should. And you must remember that alongside the named person, the rollout of various pilot schemes, the government were promoting so-called risk indicators, 222 of them actually, one of which was that if a parent is non-engaging, that's a risk factor. And so the government can't just say, oh, it's always been clear that if you're not engaged with the named person, you know, that's not a problem. It hasn't been clear at all. And so we have to listen to parents on this who are very concerned.
But Mark McDonald was very clear that if a parent was to withdraw from advice, it will not be viewed suspiciously. He was very clear about that.
Yes, and the wording of the memo that the government produced is that of itself, the non-engagement will not be a risk factor. And that is welcome as far as it goes. And the guidance says that families can accept or reject the advice of the named persons. Now, again, I have to say, the Supreme Court ordered the Scottish Government to do this. The Supreme Court said that the way that the legislation and the scheme was set up, it said that there was a risk that parents will be left with the impression that they had to do what the named person said. And so the Supreme Court invited the Scottish Government to make clear that that wasn't the case. We think that they should go further and actually legislate for a clear opt-out, but certainly this bill that we're now looking at is very different from the legislation that the government wanted to introduce. And, let's just pause to recognise that this is a victory for families. This is a victory for those who are prepared to take the Scottish Government to court.
What would be the benefits of being able to opt out of the scheme completely? Why can you imagine a parent wanting to do that? Why turn their back on support and help?
Well, you see, you put it that way. Of course, nobody turns their back on support or help. And this has been another constant issue of confusion caused by the way the government and its supporters of the scheme talk. If the named person, whatever you call the scheme, if it was a single point of contact that was there for families when they wanted it, if it was a family advocate, that helped families to obtain the services that they wanted and needed when they wanted them, who would complain about that? But as Maggie Mellon, a leading social work trainer, has said, this wasn't a scheme for parents. It was a scheme about parents. And the government has fed that suspicion and distrust of the scheme in the way that it has talked about the scheme, in the way that official leaflets have talked about the scheme. You know, this talk in a government-sponsored leaflet that said the named person would check that your child had a say in how its room was decorated and what it watched on TV. That was the government that introduced those concepts into the conversation. And so I think parents are right to be cautious. So let's just say, going forward, parents will have to be vigilant. And they will have to make sure that people aren't still sharing their data unlawfully, because we've seen that happening even under the existing law. But, you know, the power rests with the parents. So if they want to approach a named person to ask for help, of course they can. And if the named person approaches them and offers help and they don't want it, they can say, no, thank you. OK, so you, I take it, are going to disagree with the comments by the Deputy First Minister, John Swinney, who says the changes will bring consistency, clarity and coherence to the practice of sharing information about children. The government has been training named persons for years in sharing data under the laws that they wanted to bring in, which were wrong. The government has been training named persons for years to believe that they could share family data. And the Supreme Court has asked them to make changes. The Scottish Government now say that they have made those changes. They have, absolutely. And, you know, we are grateful in as far as it goes. But there is still a major problem of the culture which the named person scheme has created within the public sector. Because, you know, I take the calls from parents who are find themselves going into meetings that are not child protection meetings. There are not major concerns, but they get in that meeting and they find out 10 officials around the table, health, education and so on, and they know all kinds of personal, intimate information, not just about the children, but about their siblings and about their parents. Mm-hmm. That information has been shared unlawfully in breach of the Data Protection Act, but those parents feel powerless at that point. There's nothing they can do about it. The government has a responsibility to retrain the public sector, to tell them what we've been telling you for the past few years is flat wrong. Instead, you must comply with the Data Protection Act. Okay. You must, and that's going to take a lot of time to undo the damage that's been done by the government training up to this point. OK, Simon Calvert, I know you're staying with us. I want to hear from Peter in Inverness. I also want to hear from Christine as well, who are keen to share their views. Before we do that, let me just read out a number of texts that we've had in. They're coming in thick and fast this morning. A listener here says there is absolutely no need to provide a named person for all children. Professionals already have a duty to disclose and share information to protect vulnerable children. Health visitors and teachers are already overstretched and their time would be much better spent with families in need. As a parent, I feel it's intrusive. Sandy in the Highlands, however, says, wish this was in place 16 years ago. No one is listening or is there help available? This is a good thing for vulnerable children. 80295 is our text number. If you want to pick up the phone and take part in the conversation this morning, we are talking about named persons for your child. Changes have come into place. They were published yesterday. We're discussing them here on the programme. If you want to give us your view, 08 085 92 95 00. 08 085 92 95 00. Let's go off to Inverness. Peter, good morning. Thank you very much indeed for holding. I just wanted to make sure that we gave Simon, the platform to share his views with us. We're keen to hear yours. Good morning.
Good morning. I'm an ex-children's reporter, so I have some area of expertise in this matter. I'm long retired, so I don't have a current axe to grind, but I'm very concerned that the debate about this measure has been mired in misinformation. One of your earlier correspondents suggested that there was a mass of information being collected regarding every child in Scotland. That is completely wrong. The system only kicks in regarding any child when there's a concern raised about that child, and most parents will never have contact with the named person because, of course, there's never any need for that.
OK, well, here's the simple question then. If not every child is going to have contact with a named person, why target every child? We're back to the same arguments, aren't we?
This idea about targeting a child, the named person is passive until something comes up. It's like saying that because we have policemen, that every adult somehow has a relationship with a policeman. Of course you don't, until something comes up. It is entirely passive. It has been operating in Highland region for a number of years as a trial, and as far as I know, quite successfully. Now, it is unfortunate that I've got to say the Christian right have got hold of this and completely misrepresented the Supreme Court case in a disgraceful manner, and no wonder parents are confused.
OK, so I take it you're talking specifically about the group that Simon Calvert represents, are you?
No, our local newspaper has been bombarded with letters from the Christian right who seem to have hold of some kind of script. It's patent that none of the correspondents have actually read the Supreme Court case because they're happy to completely misquote it.
All right. Peter, stay with us. Simon, do you want to come back and respond?
Well, I mean, that's just ridiculous. Firstly, the person that referred earlier on to kind of mass gathering of information was Gabby, the supporter of the named person scheme. She said there was gathering of information, she said, with the promise not to share. It certainly was the idea of the scheme that the named person would be gathering information. So that's simply a fact.
Okay, I think we can hear Peter saying you're absolutely wrong.
I was in the Supreme Court, so I know what they said. And, what they said was that the information gathering and sharing provisions of the legislation that the Scottish Government brought forward were a breach of human rights. I would think your caller would be concerned about the privacy rights of parents. He, I'm afraid, is misrepresenting the scheme. Having said all that, we have now got these changes which drastically cut back the scheme. But the confusion about the named person has been caused by the way in which the government and its supporters have talked about the scheme, not by us. We've just pointed to things that the government has said. We've pointed to the legislation. We've pointed to the official leaflets.
OK, Simon Calvert, I should say you're from the Christian Institute and you're also a spokesperson for No to Name Person. Listening to Peter, who is a retired child protection official, he says that this is a passive scheme. This is not going to require daily engagement with children. This is a bit like the relationship we have with the police, for example. If you don't need them or you're not involved with them, then you're not going to have a relationship with them. This is very much passive.
Yeah, well, that certainly has not been the idea of the named person scheme. It was meant to be active. The legislation actually talked about the named person having a duty to monitor the well-being of all children in Scotland. And I mean, I remember being in the Supreme Court and one of the judges asking the question of the government lawyers, you really want them to monitor every child? They were incredulous that this was the way that the scheme was drafted. So this is why people have had these concerns about it. I just want to make a point about health visitors and teachers, and the point has been made already that they're overstretched. And so through their unions, they have made representations against aspects of the named person scheme, and they've often been ignored in the past. I think I want to say to people that going forward, sensible teachers and health visitors will treat their named person responsibilities with care, and they will treat the children and the families with whom they deal with care, and they will not overreach themselves. But the problem is the scheme is still trying to oblige them to act as a kind of parenting police, measuring the well-being of children. Now, the government's been clear that well-being means happiness. That is the most subjective concept you could dream of. And the idea of giving an official, a health visitor, a teacher, a statutory duty to monitor the happiness of the children that they deal with, that again is one of the remaining problems with the scheme that people are concerned about.
OK, Simon Calvert from the Christian Institute, I know you're staying with us. Let's go back to the phone lines, 08085 92 95 00. Pick up the phone if you want to join in the conversation. Peter, my thanks to you in Inverness. Good to talk to you this morning. We'll be speaking to Maggie and to Christine, but let's go to Donald, who's on the line from East Lothian. Donald, good morning. Donald, We don't have Donald. Let's go to Maggie, who's on the line from Edinburgh. Maggie, good morning.
Hi, good morning.
Thank you very much indeed for holding on. Welcome to the phone-in. We're talking about named persons for our children. Your views?
Yeah, well, I was against the named person and was very pleased that the challenge to the Supreme Court, won. What I'm really phoning to say is a plea. This all was done, the named person was done under the sort of banner of saying getting it right for every child in Scotland. I want to point out that in the time that the named person and the Govt, getting it right for every child, has been in place, things have got worse for many children in Scotland. But because of the huge range of the government's kind of interest in every child, we are missing children, or children are not being helped who need help. So poverty has increased, the number of children coming into care has increased, the services on the ground have decreased. So any pretense that this is actually improving the well-being or welfare or happiness of children in Scotland has to be really questioned. Children who are identified as having need for mental health support and services, children who are actually doing without food, they're not getting help. So it's been a big distraction, and I would plead with the Scottish Government, please get your eye on what you should be doing, and please make it right for the children who really are in need now and vulnerable.
OK, Maggie, stay with me. I want you to hear the response of Christine. Christine, good morning.
Good morning, Louise.
What do you say to Maggie?
Well, what I would say is I think I'm in favour of the named person. I think it's extremely important to have legislation in place that's going to look after the rights of every child. And to say that that child abuse happens in places primarily is a result of deprivation and poverty is completely untrue. Because one only has to look at what the recent things that have been going on that have come to light, have been going on in extremely top private schools. There's been child abuse there. It's not necessarily...
I think we all know that child abuse sadly occurs right across the social spectrum in all backgrounds, sadly.
It's not to do with poverty and deprivation.
OK. Maggie, your response.
The named person is supposed to be about the well-being of every child. It's not about abuse. We've been told that by the government. But in fact, what it has done, and what Christine said quite clearly, is it's turned every parent in Scotland into a suspect in child abuse. And meanwhile, children who are being abused have been missed. Now, sometimes that's inevitable, but in the Fife report yesterday, there was a paragraph that said the named person and the whole role of that may have caused, or seem to have caused, some confusion about roles and responsibilities. And that's because every public servant in Scotland practically was given the job of ensuring the well-being of every child, and rather than looking to the children who really are obviously in need. So it's like we can't see the wood for the trees. Now, Christine saying this is all about abuse, that is not what the Act is about. It's not what the Act said. That's what we feared. But actually, what has happened is it's turned every parent into a suspect. And as a social worker, that is a bad thing because it poisons relationships between parents
Can I just get you to actually clarify what you mean by every parent is now a suspect? What do you mean by that? I'm a parent. I don't feel under suspicion.
Well, I think you heard Simon earlier talking about the 212 risk indicators, which included things such as being young, being of a single parent. Poverty wasn't included, I don't think, funnily enough, but there was risk indicators for practically everything, and it does mean that what's happening, and this idea of gathering and sharing information, instead of that being seen, which it should be, as a very, very professional a job of professional judgment of people who know what they're doing, was extended across the whole of the public sector. And it creates, what happens is that this has happened with social work, that they've become very risk averse. Now, if you put that across the whole public sector, all the people who were called named persons and given that responsibility had a worry that they might be missing something. So they would overreact to that, and they did overreact to that. We've now got, as Simon described the meetings, people are called into meetings, and maybe, obviously it doesn't happen to every parent, but people are called into meetings to discuss some people's alarms or apprehensions or false apprehensions, but the horse has already left the stable. Everybody has been talking about it. Their privacy has been completely breached, and they feel intimidated.
Stuart in West Kilbride has texted in. He says, Louise, I'm very happy with the named person scheme and I will not be opting out. I think it's great that the government are going the extra mile to safeguard at-risk children. Just to be clear, you're not being given the option to opt out, although parents are able to disengage with advice on a case-by-case issue, just to be absolutely clear. 80295 is our text number if you want to call in and offer your views here on BBC Radio Scotland. 08085 92 95 00. My thanks to Maggie in Edinburgh and Christine as well. We'll be speaking to Mary Ellen in Ayrshire after this.
This week on The Kitchen Cafe, join Flora Shedden and Neil Forbes as they get ready for summer.
Quiche,
sausage rolls,
jam tarts, cucumber sandwiches,
cold chicken drumsticks,
strawberries.
How much do you like a picnic?
And with Wimbledon just around the corner, Judy Murray's joining them to talk tennis and help serve up some succulent summer flavours.
I had a lemon iced donut before his first match and it turned into a bit of superstition, and I had one the next day that he played and I kept it going. It's a real struggle.
I could imagine.
The Kitchen Cafe, back tomorrow from 1:30.
If I was to come round for dinner tonight, let's say, what would you cook for me?
You'd be taking your life in your hands, actually.
On BBC Radio Scotland.
Let's get back to the phone lines this morning. Mary Ellen is on the line from Ayrshire. Mary Ellen, good morning.
Good morning.
Welcome to the programme. Hopefully you've heard the various arguments being put forward. You will know that changes have now been published by the Scottish Government into named person. Where do you stand now?
Well, I agree with the Supreme Court. They say it's totalitarian in nature. I'll give you an example.
I don't think the Supreme Court said it was totalitarian in nature.
They did. I mean, that's the quote from the Supreme Court when they made the ruling. Now, before named persons, there were 64 children on the Child Protection at Risk Register in Highland. Once named person trial was introduced, 7,927 children were given a child's plan by head teacher or health visitor. Now, it's not about parents opting out. Every child must have a named person. But on top of that, the Scottish Government didn't make an announcement that they've given contracts to an American and the Yorkshire firm to share our children's medical records. They've also changed in 2013. All children's panels, the councils have been stripped of power. The person that helped them create named person is now in charge of a national children's panel. He personally selects every child panel member across Scotland. The children's panels are now for children's well-being, not because they've done something wrong. And the children's panel can demand all information on a family that is held on record. So now on top of that, the other most important thing is John Swinney has announced every school is to be taken out of council control. He's appointing named persons in every school. In Highlands, they're putting schools into clusters of 6. 5 out of 6 head teachers are being removed from the cluster.
OK, I think we're getting slightly off subject here, specifically about named person.
A named person is supervising the children with no head teacher supervision.
OK, well, they don't need to have head teacher supervision. I mean, they could be a teacher, they could be a health visitor. These changes have been brought in. John Swinney says that they are going to offer consistency, clarity and coherence.
The first named person was caught sharing her fantasies to abuse children with like-minded people. So if you have no head teacher supervising that person has got the ability to get children alone with this legislation. So when MSPs that don't have children decide that was such a good result, the first named person was sharing their fantasies to abuse children with like-minded people.
OK, I think we're getting slightly off subject here, Mary Ellen. Thank you very much indeed for your call this morning. Let's go to Georgina, who's on the line from Glenborradale. Georgina, good morning.
Good morning.
What would you like to say?
Well, in all this discussion, nobody seems to have thought that maybe children who are over the age of 10, maybe, or even younger, might like somebody to talk to who are not involved with the family at all, but might have something to advice or something to say which would help with their relationship with the family if that was going wrong. And if there was anything like some wild cult or religious bias in the family, they would be able to then suggest to the family that they tone that down or something. It seems to me that nobody has thought about how the children would react to be able to go to somebody that wasn't closely involved with them.
OK. In general, then, are you in favour of the named person scheme?
I think so. I think looking back to my childhood or teenage years, I would have been, that would have been valuable for me. And this would be a long time ago, to have somebody that wasn't in the family and that I could have gone to discuss things.
We have a listener here, they don't leave their name, but they've texted in and say, I still don't quite understand how named person is so very different from the present pastoral guidance system, which has been in place in schools for many years. What do you say to that, Georgina?
Well, I haven't any experience of the personal guide thing, but I would have thought that something that wasn't to do with school would be good.
Something out with school.
Out with school, yes.
To offer some guidance to children. Yes. OK, Georgina, many thanks indeed for your call. Let's go to Ina, who's on the line from Glasgow. Ina, good morning.
Good morning, Louise.
We're heading up to the end of the news, but I'm keen to have your say.
Well, my point was made by one of your callers just before that last lady. It's the safety element that worries me. And she raised it about the 2014 conviction of a named person for child abuse thing. And this is the thing that worries me. How safe are the named people? Who has vetted these people to say that for them to be in charge of our children, my grandchildren, how safe are they?
OK. As I've made this point already, that we understand that these will be teachers and health visitors. We're not talking about somebody who will not have been vetted, somebody who will not already be in a related profession.
Well, Louise, teachers, and I'm not saying every teacher are people that are in authority, but let's be honest, it's these kind of things are right across the board. I mean, just because you're a teacher or somebody in position doesn't mean to say that you're going to be any safer than Joe Soap in the street. It's the safety element, and as I said to your colleague, if something should go wrong with my grandchildren, and I hope nothing ever does, would I be able to sue the Scottish National Party?
Well, it is the Scottish Government that are introducing this.
The Scottish Government is the Scottish National Party.
Okay. Well, it's the Scottish Government that's introducing this. OK, listen, Ina, I want to try and squeeze in one more call. We're off to Derek in Gairloch. Derek, good morning.
Good morning, Louise.
Good morning. What would you like to say?
I'd like to say, I'd like to call a spade a spade. This policy is intrusive, and it's akin to a police state. And you were questioning Mark McDonald at the beginning of the programme as to whether or not he thinks it's a controversial policy. Well, if he doesn't think this is a controversial policy, I'd like to know what he does. And also, in Highland, as the lady previously who you have cut off knows a lot about it, the named person scheme has been in place for quite a long time.
It's been piloted there.
But in May 2016, 2-year-old child who was within the named person pilot system was left abandoned by his mother. He died. She got 10 months in jail. And this named person legislation, whether Mark McDonald likes it or not, will become his Indy Ref 2.